Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Welcome to another episode of Truth in My Days Apologetic Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about elite level apologetics, and we'll have John Torse tell us all about it. John, you have said that apologetics is for all Christians and something all Christians should do.
Yes.
But then you also say that the role of your ministry, Truth in My Days, is elite level apologetics. But what's that?
Well, giving answers is what apologetics is all about, giving reasons for our faith, answering challenges to Christianity. And it's something that all Christians do and should do. When you encounter your friends, for example, you're trying to teach them about Jesus, trying to bring them to Christ, they will probably have questions, and you want to be able to give answers. And that work is actually crucial. Surveys show that over 90% of all people who become Christians do so through the witness of personal friends, not through crusade evangelism or other venues. So it's very important to be able to answer the questions your friends have. And usually they'll have questions that we can deal with. They're honest, sincere. But in addition, they're also what we can call professional skeptics. That is, people whose career is devoted to trying to debunk Christianity. These people often have advanced degrees in biblical studies or science, and they do more than ask the honest questions your friends would. What they do is make what look to be very sophisticated and perhaps on the surface compelling attacks against the Bible and against Christianity. They'll do things like appealing to the meaning of the original languages of the Bible, to ancient historical documents, to archaeology, or to supposedly scientific claims. And when people come on this level of attack, they need to be answered on the same level. The need to go into the original languages of the Bible, science, and so on. And that's what we call elite level apologetics. That's one reason that we need to do it. Another reason that we need to do it is that a lot of apologetics challenges have been around for a long time, and you can find books with answers to it. Most of them will have good answers. There's somewhere a lot of Christian apologists still haven't come up with good answers, but there also, every once in a while, a new challenge will come up, something new, totally unexpected, an entirely new attack, and there is no ready answer to be found in our books. And this kind of situation requires us not just to formulate a response, but to do it almost immediately so that the new challenge doesn't have a chance to get off the ground and cause problems. And again, this is in the realm of elite level apologetics.
So can you give us an example?
Sure. An example of what's called the Talpiot tomb.
What's the Talpiot tomb?
Talpiot tomb is a tomb in the southeast part of Jerusalem, a place called Talpiot. And this tomb held ossuaries. Ossuaries are bone boxes. The Jews of Jesus' day, for a period of about 70 years, had a burial practice that went like this. When a person died, he would be put into a tomb, wrapped in linens with spices. He'd be put into a tomb. The tomb would be sealed. And they'd come back in 1 year's time, open the tomb, and they'd find the bones of the person. The bones would be collected and put into a stone box called an ossuary. And often the name of the person would actually be inscribed on the side of the box. Now, this practice really took place only from about the turn of the 1st century AD up until the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. So when we find tombs with ossuaries in them, we know that they date somewhere between 0 and AD 70, which is includes the time span of Jesus walking the earth. Now, what happened, this was in the year 2007, a documentary filmmaker crew actually went inside one of these tombs. They inserted a camera to look at what's inside. And what they found was supposedly astonishing. And newspapers around the world carried these fantastical headlines. In our National Post, the headline was, "Canadian Director Claims Jesus Tomb Found." The Toronto Star put it this way, "Jesus Tomb Claims Sparks Furor. TO Director's documentary says wife, son also found at burial site." Globe and Mail had Has film crew found the DNA of Jesus? Was Mary Magdalene married to Jesus? The New York Times had, very simply, crypt held bodies of Jesus and his family, film says. And that was the claim, that the ossuary, the bone box of Jesus, had now been found.
How do they know? Did they have Jesus and all his family members' names there or something?
Well, what they found inside the tomb was a total of 9 ossuaries, and 6 of them were inscribed. And this is where it became fascinating, because the names on the ossuaries included Jose, just Joseph, Maria, Mary, Mattia, Matthew, Judah, son of Jesus, Maria Mene, which they speculated might be Mary Magdalene, and the 6th one said on it, Jesus, son of Joseph. And that was what the shocking point was. Jesus, son of Joseph. Who is that but the Jesus of the Bible? His ossuary had been found. That means he had been buried. He didn't rise. He died a year later. They put his bones into this box. Well, if Jesus' bones are in that box there, it means he didn't rise from the dead. And that obviously would be devastating for Christianity if that were true.
How did Christian apologists respond?
Well, the initial response was this. They said, it can't be the tomb of Jesus. You see, Jesus' family was a poor Galilean family. They couldn't have afforded to have had a tomb in Jerusalem.
Well, why did they think Jesus' family was poor, though?
Well, they thought Jesus' family was poor because you read in Luke 2:22-24, after Mary's period of purification according to the law of Moses was done, she came to the temple and offered a sacrifice. Read a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. But if you look back at where that original law is given in Leviticus 12, you were supposed to bring a lamb and a young pigeon. But if you couldn't bring a lamb, if you couldn't afford one, then you would bring a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So the fact that Mary and Joseph opted for this suggests that they were too poor to afford a lamb. However, there's a problem with that argument. 2 problems, actually. Number 1, were they really poor? Well, you look at the offering and say yes. But what these people overlooked was sometime later, not that much later, along came the wise men, the Magoi from the east, and they brought Jesus some very significant gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh. We don't know how much of these they brought, but it was meant to be a tribute to a king, a gift, an act of worship. It would have been a goodly amount. Jesus' family was probably set for life. They could have afforded multiple tombs in Jerusalem if they wanted to. The second reason this is not a good argument is you can't really override the facts on the ground. Okay? The filmmakers are telling us here is the actual ossuary, says on it, Jesus, son of Joseph. It's right there. So to have an apologist saying, well, it couldn't because they were too poor, doesn't override the actual evidence of it being there.
So then where did the apologists go next? What do they say?
Well, the next idea then was to point to the commonality, how common those names were. They said names like Jesus, Mary, Judah, Joseph. They were very common Jewish names in the 1st century AD. So it doesn't mean much that they were all found in the same tomb.
Is that a good argument?
It really isn't, actually. The problem here is while the names may be common, each one by itself common, the combination isn't. And if you look at the statistical probability of having all of those names in the tomb, it starts becoming very, very low. If you flip a coin, okay, for example, what are the chances of getting a heads? A head, its chances is 50%. It's 1 out of 2, and that's very common. You flip it again, the chances are 1 out of 2. Every time you flip it, it's 1 out of 2. Each, it's a common occurrence. But what if you flip it twice in a row? What are the chances of getting 2 heads? Well, that's 1 in 2 times 1 in 2. It's 1 in 4. The odds of flipping it 3 times is 1 in 2 times 1 in 2 times 1 in 2, 1 in 8. So while each name on its own may be common, you look at the probability of all of those names in the same tomb, those 6 names, the probability becomes much lower. In fact, the documentary filmmakers commissioned a statistician, a fellow named Andre Feuerwerger, professor at the University of Toronto, who calculated that the odds that all 6 names would appear together in one tomb are 1 in 600, calculated conservatively. Less conservatively, it could be perhaps 1 in 1600, which would mean that the chance, he said, of this not being the family of Jesus of the Bible, the chance would be 1 in 600. So it's 599 chances out of 600, or 1,599 chances out of 1,600 that yes, this is Jesus. This is the Jesus of the Bible.
Oh, that doesn't sound good, because Christianity rests fundamentally on the bodily resurrection of Jesus. That's how he proved himself and how he can beat death. So what about 1 Corinthians 15? If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. We are of all men the most pitiable.
Indeed, you've got that exactly right. And some of the responses that came from professing Christians was actually very troubling. If you looked in the newspapers, the letters that came after, one would say, well, whether allegorical or real, the resurrection of Jesus is the defining moment of the early Christian churches. Another one said, regardless of the veracity of the recent findings in the Talpiot tomb. Yet another one said that the producer does not argue that Jesus did not ascend to heaven, at least spiritually. So they're all willing to give way on this and say, look, well, okay, Jesus' body is still in the tomb, doesn't matter. But you know what? It does. It fundamentally matters. As you said, if Christ is not risen, our faith is futile. If Jesus didn't rise, why follow him? Why not follow Muhammad? Why not follow Buddha? Why not follow Krishna, Joseph Smith, Sun Myung Moon, Nachum Schneerson, Baal, Mithras, Zeus? What would make Jesus different from any of these? What makes Jesus different is the resurrection. If you look at John chapter 2, after Jesus has driven the money changers out of the temple, Jewish leaders come to him and say, what sign do you show us since you do these things? Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. So notice that Jesus himself gave as proof the resurrection of his body, not a spiritual ascension, not an allegory, that his body will be raised within 3 days. It was always the proof he pointed to. If we look at Luke 18, for example, when he tells, they're wedding up to Jerusalem, what is written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. Read, for he will be delivered to the Gentiles and will be mocked and insulted and spit upon. They will scourge him and kill him, and the 3rd day he will rise again. That's what he pointed to prove. That's the thing he did that none of those others we mentioned did. Muhammad did not rise from the dead. Buddha did not rise from the dead. Krishna did not rise from the dead. Joseph Smith, Menachem Schneerson, none of them did. This is the thing that Christianity rests on and the basis for its truth claims. In Romans chapter 1, Paul puts it this way. The gospel of God, which he promised before through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his son Jesus Christ our Lord, was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. And then that was the sum total of the apostolic preaching. This Jesus, whom you killed, God raised from the dead. And so you see, fundamentally, this is crucial. It is absolutely crucial. You see why, right?
Yeah, if Jesus' bones are in that tomb, that would mean he didn't actually rise from the dead, and that would mean Christianity is false.
Exactly. There were other people, in fact, even in Jesus' day, around Jesus' time, who laid claim to being the Messiah. Gamaliel mentions 2 of them in the book of Acts, chapter 5, verses 35 to 37, where we read, and he said to the men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men," it's the apostles. "For some time ago, Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee, rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed." That pattern is always repeated. A Jewish Messiah who dies and stays dead is a fake. People won't follow a fake Messiah because they know a fake Messiah cannot give them what they're looking for. So it's absolutely not. What would that mean then?
Well, if Jesus' bones are in the tomb, he didn't rise from the dead. So if there's actually Jesus' bones, then this argument from the skeptics would overturn the claims of Christianity, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. If you could actually prove those are his bones, it would. But against that, what we do have is this apostolic testimony, this repeated apostolic testimony that these people saw the risen Jesus. In Acts chapter 1, Luke puts it this way: "All that Jesus began both to do and teach until the day in which he was taken up, after he through the Holy Spirit had given commandments to the apostles whom he had chosen, to whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them during 40 days, and speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God." So if he's still in the tomb, how can that be? Were they making this up? Were they fooled? Were they lying? Was it just a vision? Was it a spiritual vision? Absolutely not. When Jesus appeared to his apostles after his resurrection in Luke 24, they didn't believe it. It's too good to be true. They thought he might be a ghost. Okay? It's his spirit. And what does Jesus do? He has to show that he's actually risen physically, bodily. He says, "Behold my hands and my feet." That's where the holes were from the crucifixion. "That it is I myself. Handle me and see, for spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. It's still hard to convince. But while they still did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, "Have you any food here?" So they gave him a piece of a broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence. They're very hard to convince. And then we find Thomas. Thomas was not with them when Jesus appeared to them there. And he said, "I'm not going to believe. I don't care what you guys say. Unless I can see myself, unless I can actually put my hands into the hole in his side and into the holes in his hands, I'm not going to believe." And 8 days later, Jesus appears to him and shows himself physically present, physically risen. And Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." So we got a problem. The evidence that we have says that Jesus rose from the dead. And now we have this countervailing evidence from this documentary film, these filmmakers who have found the ossuary of Jesus. If this is true, then Jesus didn't rise bodily. It would mean that Jesus has been moldering in the grave since the first century. We just didn't know it until now.
So is there anything that can overturn this challenge of the ossuaries? Because if those are actually the bones of Jesus, then the ossuaries would overturn the claims of Christianity.
But here's the question. Is this really the ossuary of Jesus? This, folks, this is where you really need to get in some elite level apologetics. This is something that hasn't come up before. This is not something where you can pull a book off your shelf, a book on apologetics, and look up the answer. Here's where the apologist has to respond, and he has to respond quickly. But you saw what came out. Well, Jesus found couldn't afford a tomb. The names were common. These are exceedingly weak arguments.
Isn't there any better response?
Most certainly there is. But to do it, you're going to have some basic skill sets in some other areas, including probability analysis. So let's look at how we do this. The first and obvious thing you would do is look at what is the linchpin of the claim. By linchpin, we mean what is the one thing that all of it rests on? What is the one thing that if we remove, the entire argument collapses? And what it is that one ossuary on which it is written, Jesus, son of Joseph. If that one's not there, it wouldn't even matter if the rest of them are indeed Jesus' family. It wouldn't matter because Jesus himself would still not be buried. The linchpin is that one ossuary that says, Jesus, son of Joseph. And Christians go into shock because who else could that be? We know Jesus, son of Joseph. That's Jesus of the Bible, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. But is that really the only Jesus, son of Joseph, who lived at that time? Was there really only that one? The apologists told us that the names in Israel were common. In and of itself, that, as we've showed, doesn't prove anything. What you have to first ask is how common? How common was the name Jesus? How common was the name Joseph? Well, fortunately, work has been done by scholars analyzing various inscriptions, ossuaries, and so on. And we know pretty accurately, 9% of all men at that time were named Jesus, which is actually the English form of the Greek form of Joshua. 9%. 14% of all men at that time were named Joseph. So, what is the chance of a man in first century Israel being named Jesus, son of Joseph? Well, you have to multiply the probabilities together. 9% times 14%, you get 1.26%. 1.26% of all the men in Israel at that time were named Jesus, son of Joseph. About 4 out of every 500 men had that name. The next question then is, okay, 4 out of every 500 men, how many men were there? What was the Jewish male population of Israel during Jesus' earthly lifetime? The answer is about 3 million people. They weren't all in Jerusalem. They weren't all in Israel. They were scattered in the so-called diaspora, but a total of about 3 million. So how many men were there at that time who would have been named Jesus, son of Joseph? And the answer is, you multiply that 1.26% by the 3 million, the answer is 37,800. There were not one Jesus, son of Joseph, the one we know from the Bible. There were 37,800 Jesus, son of Joseph. And now you see suddenly that burden of proof gets turned upside down. Suddenly, the chance of that fellow in that ossuary being the Jesus of the Bible, suddenly very, very little. The chance is 1 in 37,800, which is really not nearly enough to overturn the eyewitness testimony we have. We don't need to doubt the eyewitness testimony because there's 37,799 other Jesus, son of Joseph that could have been in that tomb.
Okay, but even if Jesus, son of Joseph, is the linchpin, there's still the fact that it was found with those other ossuaries with the names of Jesus' family.
True. That's one objection the skeptics might bring up. There's another one as well. They would say that, well, why are you including all of the Jewish men from Israel, from all over the world? Why aren't you including only the ones that actually lived in Jerusalem? It'd be a much smaller number. It would change the statistics, wouldn't it? And yes, that argument is brought up by skeptics. One editor of a Canadian news magazine actually gave me that argument when I showed him these numbers. But that fails. And it fails for 3 reasons. What if we did? What if instead of using the entire Jewish male population, we used only the male population of Jerusalem? Numbers would be a lot smaller, but there would still be 252 Jesus, son of Joseph. So the odds would still be 251 against 1, against it being our Jesus. So once again, that cannot override the eyewitness testimony. The second reason that argument fails is because we can't restrict ourselves only to Jews who lived in Jerusalem. One interesting ossuary that was discovered in 1941 was the ossuary of the son of Simon of Cyrene, who's mentioned in the gospel books, the one that was forced to carry Jesus' cross. Simon of Cyrene wasn't from Jerusalem. He was from Cyrene. And Cyrene is on the north coast of Africa. It's quite a ways away from Jerusalem. And yet he was buried there. It's not surprising at all. Jerusalem was the holy city. Jews would like to be buried there, pious Jews. The existence there of this ossuary proves that not only people from Jerusalem were buried in tombs in Jerusalem. This one was found in the Kidron Valley, just outside Jerusalem. The third reason, and this is fatal to the skeptics, so I'm surprised they bring it up. If the ossuary could only be from someone who lived in Jerusalem, then it's not Jesus of the Bible. He didn't live in Jerusalem. He grew up in Nazareth, and during his ministry, spent most of his time when he's not traveling around in Capernaum, both in Galilee. So if you say only somebody who was born in Jerusalem, somebody who lived in Jerusalem could be in one of those tombs, then that settles it. It's not Jesus of the Bible. Now, the other question that you brought up is the names of the other people in the tomb. And this is what they try to say. This is what the statistician calculated, the odds of this not being Jesus' family, because now we're not looking just at the odds about Jesus, but at the other names.
I remember hearing a radio talk show host at the time. He'd interviewed the producer who had given this analogy. Suppose walking in the English countryside 100 years or so in the future, we came to a cemetery and we go in and find a tomb there, and on it is inscribed the names John, Paul, George, and Richard. So you know the Beatles drummer Ringo Starr's real name was Richard Starkey. So we see John, Paul, George, and Richard, and although these are all common names in England, the combination would not be common, it would be very rare, and we would conclude that this crypt was the crypt of the Beatles. Now that analogy does sound compelling, but what if we took a closer look and we saw that instead of Paul, it actually said Raul? Well, perhaps that was a spelling mistake, and then we look again and we see that it says Richard, son of George. Well, Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr, could not have been the son of George Harrison, being born before George was. We'd have to conclude at this point that the names don't, in fact, match those of the Beatles. They're close, but they don't match, and this is not the crypt of the Beatles. So now let's see if the group of names found on the bone boxes in the Talpiot tomb actually match those of Jesus' family.
But first, let's look at what we know about Jesus' family. Okay? We know his father was named Joseph, and his adoptive father, technically. Mother was Mary. That's Matthew 1:16 and elsewhere. Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. We know he had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. In Mark 6:3, we read, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" So we know the names of his brothers.
Now we could mention at this point that there's an ossuary, one of the bone boxes, that came to light some years earlier. And it had on it the fascinating inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Unfortunately, we don't know the provenance of this ossuary, that is, where it was originally found. It showed up in the hands of a collector, and it was assailed for a long time as being a fake. But finally, it was ruled authentic. Probably it is the ossuary of Jesus' brother, because it's very unusual to put in a brother's name. Probably indicates that the brother was someone very, very special. Now, the documentary filmmaker tried to suggest that this box may originally have come from the Talpiot tomb, and that would make the combination of names in the tomb even rarer. But there is actually no evidence for that claim. And as we see, as we're about to see, it wouldn't make a difference.
So let's look at the names in the Talpiot tomb and see how they measure up. One of them is inscribed Maria. That'd have to be a yes and a no. Yes, his mother's name was Mary, but it's a common name. 21.4% of women were named Mary at that time. Furthermore, this one is written in the Latin form. It's not written in the Aramaic form, the Hebrew form. Why would it be written in the Latin form if it was the mother of Jesus of the Bible? One of the ossuaries has Jose on it. Yes, we see one of Jesus' brothers had that name. One is called Judah. Now, there's a no on that. There was a Judah in Jesus' family. He was a brother of Jesus. And the ossuary says son of Jesus. So that doesn't match what we know about Jesus' family. There's a Matthew in there, Mattia. That doesn't fit. Matthew was an apostle. He was not a family member of Jesus. And then the other one has on it Mariamene, and that doesn't fit either. There's a Greek form of a name. It's not a Hebrew form. And there's no evidence whatsoever to link it to Mary Magdalene. So what we have here is these names don't really fit the names of Jesus' family. There's a bit of overlap, but there's more difference than there's commonality. If we come back to what that professor at the University of Toronto did, he calculated the odds that these 6 names would appear together in one tomb. And that's exactly correct. He calculated that correctly as far as we know. But that's what he calculated. The odds of this particular constellation of names appearing in one tomb. He did not calculate the odds about whether or not this is Jesus' family. Calculate only the constellation of names. Whether it could be Jesus' family depends on whether those are in fact the names of Jesus' family members, and they are not. Now, if we look at the unlikelihood as well of this particular constellation of names, our statistician told us that its odds are 1 in 600. Well, Jewish population at the time was 6 million approximately. If the average family size was 6, there would have been 1,667 families with this constellation of names. If the average size of the family is 12, there would have been 313 families with this particular constellation of names. So it's unlikely, but there are enough people there to have this constellation of names in one tomb 313 times over. So there's no reason to attribute it to Jesus of the Bible, and it's not possible to do because they don't fit the known facts of the Bible. So when we look at this, we see that the claim, which came out and could seem so troubling, so much so that there were Christians who were saying, well, maybe the resurrection is allegorical, maybe it was a spiritual ascension. It's not a problem at all. It's not a problem at all. What you need to do is look at the facts, look carefully, look at the numbers, put them in context, do your probability analysis, and you see that the troubling claims just crumble to dust. Crumble to dust. We don't need to be left with best answer being, well, Jesus' family was poor, which is not true. Well, the names were common. We still have to prove, over against the statistics offered by the documentary filmmaker, we need to prove why the common nature of the names disproves the claim. So that's the first thing that elite apologetics has to do, is come up with good, solid answers to every challenge, even the new ones. The second thing it has to do then is to get that information out to the people as quickly as possible, because if this spreads, people can begin to have doubts. People who are considering Christianity may think, now we don't have to do it. So the next thing the elite level projects has to do is get that out. These were published in newspapers. Letters to the editor is always a good way to reach the same audience and to do it quickly. And here, what you have to do is put the maximum amount of response, maximum amount of information to the minimum amount of space. You don't usually get a lot of space in a letter to the editor, so you have to write it in a way that gets your key points done and is convincing within the space. So we did that. We sent out letters to the newspapers. 2 of them published it, so that's good. Nice if all of them did, but at least 2 did, so the information did get out to the general public. Toronto Star usually doesn't give so many words, so we have to be much more succinct on this one. But this is how you put it out. And this was our letter in the Toronto Star. The claim that the tomb of the Jesus of the Bible has been found is risible. Yes, an ossuary has been discovered that is inscribed Jesus, son of Joseph. What people may not realize, however, is that based on the frequency of the names Jesus and Joseph and the total Jewish population in the first century Israel, there would have been at least 8,000 people named Jesus, son of Joseph, living at the time. Furthermore, although the very common names found inscribed on some of the other ossuaries match names in Jesus' family, others, such as Matthew, don't, proving that this was a family of another one of the 8,000 Jesuses, son of Joseph. Add to that the fact that the eyewitness testimony in the New Testament tells us that Jesus was dead and buried, after which his tomb was empty, and he appeared alive to them, and it's clear that the Canadian director's claim can be roundly dismissed. So that's how you do it. A very brief, quick, to the point response. If you have more space, more words, you can make it a little bit longer, a little more detailed. Like our letter in the National Post, which went like this: the claim that the tomb of Jesus has been found does not withstand careful scrutiny. The centerpiece of the claim is an ossuary marked Jesus, son of Joseph. In fact, based on the frequency of these names in the total Jewish population in first century Israel, it can be shown that there were at least 8,000 Jesus, son of Josephs, living at the time Jesus of Nazareth. Even if all of the things were equal, it would be highly unlikely that this would be that Jesus. But all things are not equal. Despite the efforts of the documentary film producers to massage the evidence, the names on the other ossuaries do not match those of Jesus' family. There was no Matthew in Jesus' family. He was an apostle. There was a Judah, but he was Jesus' brother, not son. And the suggestion that Mary's name, and only Mary's, was recorded in the Latin form, not in Aramaic, because more Romans became followers, is risible. Attention to Mary didn't start until centuries later. Clearly, this was the family of another Jesus. Add to this the fact that the eyewitness testimony in the New Testament records that Jesus was buried, after which the tomb was empty, and the risen Jesus appeared to them, and it is undeniable that the producer's case has no merit at all. So when you do this, you get that information out to the public immediately, and the lie, the challenge, doesn't get a chance to have traction. And that, folks, is what elite apologetics is all about.
Thank you for that clear explanation. You cleared up the problem very nicely, and now this argument seems totally ridiculous. Thank you.
Yes, I think we can go exactly as the angel said to the ladies in the tomb, Matthew 28:6. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. That fact remains undeniable, unchallengeable, unassailable. Our faith rests on that solid foundation that Jesus rose from the dead.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.